He was 3.5 years old when the Carter family decided to take him home. Steve Carter's parents kept him aware of all that they knew about his life before they adopted him. The guy was aware of the fact that his parents adopted him from a foster care center in Hawaii. However, his curiosity to know his roots and the urge to learn more about his biological family led him to some unexpectedly odd details. In 1980, Steve Carter SR, a United States Army officer, was posted on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. He was staying on the island with his wife, Pat. The couple has made up their mind to adopt a child to raise as their own. When they went to a nearby foster care, the Carters instantly felt a strong connection with a 3.5-year-old boy. As Pat said in an interview and still admits, it was love at first sight. According to the files, the fair-haired infant's name was Tenzin Amia, and the little boy was brought into foster care 3 years back in June 1977. The state's record also mentioned that he was born on January 16, 1977. He was brought in for adoption merely few months after he was born. On September 23, 1980, when all the paperwork was finally completed, the couple was given full-time custody of this charming little angel. They welcomed him in his new home with a new name, William Stephen Tenzin Carter. It didn't take him much time to get accustomed to the new lifestyle. Soon after they settled the adoption procedures, they moved back from Hawaii to their town. Steve Jr. spent his childhood in Medford Lakes, a small town in southern New Jersey, the Garden State. Tenzin, who became Steve Jr., had a great strike of luck with his new loving family. During the 1980s and 90s, he lived an ordinary happy life with his family and friends. He was either playing different sports or at parties with the rest of the kids in his neighborhood. It was the kind of life every orphan kid wishes to have. While everything was perfect, Steve Jr. kept wondering about his past life and who his real parents were. For several years after his adoption, Pat and I had a nagging fear that someone might pop up claiming to be his biological mother or father. When nobody did, our anxiety eventually passed. His father said in an interview and added, "We kept in contact with the woman who had him in foster care. We called her when we had questions about measles or mumps and sent her letters during the holidays." As he was grown up, it was time for Steve Jr. to leave his parents' home for college, pursuing a software engineering degree. He had a perfect childhood with completely understanding parents who always believed in his dreams and encouraged him to pursue things he loved. The young man was sad to leave his parents behind, but was also quite excited about the new life that lay ahead of him. Even at this point, he had no clue that soon his past would stand face to face with him. We belong to an adoptee/birth parent clearinghouse, ALMA, that connects people who are looking for each other but never received any messages. When Steve turned 18, we asked him if he wished to continue registering on the site, and he declined, his father said in an interview. But Steve's interest was soon to return about this topic. When Steve Jr. moved away from his parents, the thought of his birth parents became haunting. With his blonde hair, blue eyes, and a light complexion, his father explained in an interview and further added, "He does not strike one as being of Polynesian extraction." This was now a confusing fact for him, as the record said he was Hawaii, but his features were opposite. With so much going on in his mind, Steve Jr. decided to just confirm his ethnicity by DNA test. He got a DNA testing kit as one of his Christmas presents, which coincided perfectly with his quest. Steve didn't give it a second thought and took the test. The test result was nothing he'd expected. Steve received the reports, finding out that he actually had Scandinavian ancestry, which meant he was European. He was hoping this will end his curiosity and will help in living a normal life, but the DNA reports made him more confused than ever. Back in 2011, Steve's eye stopped on one story as he could relate himself with the story of this African-American woman, Carlina White. As an infant, she was taken away from a hospital in Harlem, New York City. She had no idea of her real identity while growing up in Connecticut. Carlina kidnapper raised her as her daughter, and she always thought she was her birth mother. Meanwhile, her actual parents never stopped searching for her, not knowing that they were actually living just 4 to 5 minutes away from their daughter. Steve knew that he had to do something about this. Then Steve read about Carlina White, who discovered she was kidnapped as an infant from a hospital in New York. The article mentioned references she used for her search, his father recalls. Steve was now a married man and had some doubts as to whether he should give it a try or not. In such moments of doubts, Tracy, his wife, always supported him and pushed him to give things a try, especially when it concerned his birth parents. Steve knew about methods related to genealogy to track long-lost relatives, which was a very simple task now, thanks to the internet. He followed the same procedure that Carlina mentioned and started looking for his long-forgotten family on a website that is sponsored by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Steve once got access to the site and started scrolling and scrolling. After scrolling more than 100 of times, his eyes instantly stopped at a photo and he was numb for a moment. It was just the beginning of the unraveling process, and Steve had no idea of where to start from. Was someone somewhere looking for him? And if that was the case, then how did he even end up in foster care? When Steve saw the picture of a person looking exactly like him, he immediately called his parents and asked them to check the website. It was the spitting image of Steve. He called Pat and me immediately and told us to look at the website. We were flabbergasted, his father recalled. The list of missing boys showed a person named Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes, who was missing since June 1977. Along with this name, there was an age progression sketch of Mark, how he might look now as a young teen. I got chills. I was like, holy crap, that's me. Steve recalled that moment in an interview. Steve wasn't sure about what he just saw, and he decided to get in touch with the authorities. He was guided through a process of DNA testing. The results came after 8 long months, after which he found out that Marks, the missing boy, and him were actually the same person. Steve had mixed feelings about meeting anyone who was related to his missing poster posting. The entire situation was too overwhelming, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to know more about how he got missing. His wife, however, insisted on him to take a step further and try to find out about how he came to the Hawaiian foster care in 1977. Steve Jr. decided to listen to his wife's advice and carried on with his investigation. As he got deeper, he found out that on June 21, 1977, journalist and Vietnam vet Mark Barnes was working in the garden of his home in Hauula, Oahu, Hawaii. He lived there with his girlfriend, Charlotte Moriarty, who took their 6-month-old son to the grocery store to run some errands. While Mark was occupied with gardening, Charlotte waved him goodbye and left for the store, but the two never returned home. Charlotte had the bad habit of taking off without telling anyone, not even her boyfriend and father of her child. She would return whenever she felt like it, which is why Mark was worried about her absence as he grew used to her random takeoffs. But when 3 weeks passed and Charlotte was still gone, he decided to finally inform the police. Unfortunately for him, they weren't able to trace her anywhere. The police never found Marks and his mother, and their photos stayed on the missing persons list for years after. Mark kept searching for them everywhere for more than a year. After being failed by the police, he decided to take things in his own hands and kept on looking for them, hanging posters with their pictures everywhere he could. After more than a year with no result in sight, he started to succumb to the idea that they were probably both dead. He never imagined that his little Marks would be living a completely different life with a different name far across the ocean. I spent about a year and a half going crazy driving around the island. It was rough, Steve's birth father recalled. Marks and Charlotte were supposed to go for a regular walk, as was their habit every afternoon. This time, however, Charlotte changed her way and went to a different part of Oahu. They made their way to a random empty house. When the owner of the house returned after a few months, she instantly called the police as she suspected something odd in her house, and indeed there was. When the police arrived, Charlotte managed to play a trick that would change the two families' fate forever. When the police got there, Charlotte made up fake names of her and her son. She said her name was Jane and her son's name was Tenzin Amia. She went further and gave them a false birth date when they asked her son's date of birth. The police took her word for it and never assumed that Tenzin could be the missing Marks. Charlotte was diagnosed with mental illness, after which she was sent to a psychiatric facility, and Marks was given to the state's foster care. Within a few days, Charlotte managed to escape from the hospital and was never seen again. With Charlotte going missing, the true story of her son went missing as well. Marks would be living only 30 miles away from his birth father's place for the next 3 years. Mark wasn't the only person who was looking for Marks. His half-sister, Jennifer, who was 8 years older than Marks, never lost hope of her brother's return. She kept praying for her younger brother to be safe and well. In 2001, she managed to convince the authorities to reopen the case files. An artist was assigned to make a sketch of how Marks would possibly look like as a teen. This very sketch is how Steve Jr. got his hands on the picture, and his true identity was revealed. After the truth was revealed, defying everybody's expectations, Steve wasn't in a hurry to meet his birth family. He shared his feelings later in an interview, saying that actually felt terrified. He wasn't near ready to meet his real family. Things were hectic enough, and him meeting them would only make everything more complicated. I felt like we'd taken someone else's child. Though that wasn't true, truthfully, I thought they were dead. I was really numb, said Jennifer, who recalls growing up scanning crowds to find her missing brother. Steve decided to take his time to get familiar with the fact that he could actually meet his birth father. After months of coming to peace with it, he finally had the courage to call his sister, Jennifer, and later on with his biological father. Mark, who now lived in California, was overwhelmed after hearing the voice of his son. Mark remembered the moment. All I could say was, wow, oh wow, wow. While Steve was dealing with his own fears, his adoptive parents had their own concerns. On an emotional level, I felt like we'd taken someone else's child. It's taken a while for us to get used to the idea that we have to share him. But I'm sure it's going to be wonderful, his parents recall. Steve has spoken to his biological father several times. Pat and I have not. We have no plans to meet him, but with Steve's permission, we might go somewhere down the road, his adoptive father told the newspapers. We met the artist who created the photos Steve discovered on the web. We also met several investigators from the center and one from the Honolulu Police Department, who all worked together on the case following Steve's initial contact, tells Steve's adoptive father, who wanted to know more about his son's past. After Steve Marks' reunion with his birth father, Steve's adoptive parents started showing a lot of interest in the police work, which helped bring back families together. He said, "We learned about the wonderful work that the NCMEC does, not only to find missing children, but also to reunite parents and children who have been separated by disasters such as Hurricane Katrina. It's an amazing group of highly skilled and dedicated people." Mark finally took the great step and met both his birth father and sister. His birth father and the Carter family met later in the coming year. Steve's adoptive parents finally came to accept the fact that Steve is both families' son. We believe Steve's story is one of hope for all those parents who have suffered and continue to suffer the unexpected disappearance of a child. His parents understand that Steve was fortunate enough to reunite with his family. Many others don't get the same chance. Steve and Jennifer still managed to stay in touch. They still meet each other and spend holidays and festive events together. Their reunion was nothing less of a miracle. Steve's story ignited the flames of hope for all people who are still looking for their long-missing family members. Even though the chances of finding their missing relatives decrease with years, the ray of hope always tries to hold on to the smallest chance to keep shining. Stories like this make people do their best to keep their missing relatives' cases open and put the missing image on large platforms like missing people's websites that are governed by the authorities. The story of Steve Jr. is one unbelievable story. If it hadn't been for his sister insisting on reopening his case and his efforts trying to track down his birth parents, he would have lived thinking he was Hawaiian and never get the closure for his mysterious history. But most importantly, his father wouldn't have been reunited with his long-lost son and would have to carry on living thinking his son was long dead.